The gavel echoed through Superior Courtroom 7 as Judge Harrison Mitchell adjusted his robes with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged in his 30-year career. Across the mahogany bench, a young black woman in a crisp navy suit organized her files with methodical precision. Mitchell's lips curled into a familiar smirk. Another public defender, another easy victory. But what happened next would shatter everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and the very foundation of justice itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning fog clung to the glass towers of downtown Sacramento as Victoria Chambers stepped out of her silver sedan in the courthouse parking garage. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that presence spoke louder than words. Her law school classmates at Stanford had often mistaken her measured demeanor for uncertainty, a mistake that cost them dearly during moot court competitions. Victoria checked her watch, 8:47 a.m. Judge Mitchell's docket started at 9 sharp, and punctuality in his courtroom wasn't just expected, it was demanded. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing every precedent, every procedural nuance that might arise in today's hearing. The Peterson custody case should have been straightforward, but nothing involving family court ever truly was. The elevator climbed to the 7th floor with mechanical precision. Through the glass doors of Superior Courtroom 7, Victoria could see the familiar choreography of morning preparation. Court clerks shuffled papers, bailiffs checked security protocols, and attorneys whispered last-minute strategies to nervous clients. She pushed through the heavy doors, her heels clicking against polished marble. Judge Harrison Mitchell emerged from his chambers at exactly 9 a.m., black robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. At 55, he possessed the bearing of old money and older prejudices, though he'd learned over the decades to keep the latter carefully concealed beneath judicial propriety. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his jaw set in the perpetual expression of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority. Mitchell's eyes swept the courtroom with practiced efficiency, cataloging the morning's players. Defense attorneys, prosecutors, social workers, concerned family members, all the usual suspects in the endless drama of human conflict that played out daily in his domain. His gaze lingered momentarily on Victoria, noting her youth, her race, the slightly worn briefcase that suggested legal aid rather than private practice. The Peterson case was called third on the docket. Robert Peterson, a construction foreman with calloused hands and worry lines etched deep around his eyes, sat beside his attorney at the plaintiff's table. His ex-wife Maria had retained Victoria to represent her interests in their ongoing custody dispute over 8-year-old Emma. The case had been building for months, a slow-burning conflict fueled by accusations, counter-accusations, and the grinding machinery of a system that too often treated children as prizes to be won, rather than lives to be protected. Maria Peterson clutched a tissue in her left hand, her wedding ring long since removed, but the pale band of skin still visible. She'd worked double shifts at St. Mary's Hospital as a nurse to afford legal representation, determined to maintain custody of the daughter who represented everything good that had survived her marriage's collapse. Victoria rose when her case was called, her voice clear and steady as she announced her representation. Judge Mitchell barely glanced up from his paperwork, already forming assumptions based on decades of similar scenarios. Young lawyer, probably fresh from some public interest program, idealistic and inexperienced. The combination of her age and assignment suggested this would be resolved quickly. The hearing began with Robert Peterson's attorney, Benjamin Crawford, a silver-haired veteran of family court who'd built his reputation on aggressive tactics and intimate knowledge of judicial preferences. Crawford presented his client's case with theatrical precision, painting Maria as an unstable mother whose work schedule left Emma inadequately supervised. Victoria listened carefully, taking notes not just on Crawford's arguments, but on Judge Mitchell's reactions. She'd researched his judicial history extensively and knew his patterns, his tendency to favor fathers in custody disputes, his impatience with emotional appeals, his preference for attorneys who shared his country club sensibilities. When her turn came to present Maria's case, Victoria stood with quiet dignity. She methodically dismantled Crawford's arguments, presenting evidence of Robert's drinking problem, his history of missed visitation appointments, his failure to maintain steady employment. Her preparation was thorough, her legal reasoning sound, but Judge Mitchell's expression remained skeptical. The testimony phase revealed the true complexity of the Peterson family's dysfunction. Emma's teacher testified about the child's recent behavioral changes, her declining grades, her tearful requests to speak with the school counselor. A neighbor described hearing raised voices and the sound of breaking glass from the Peterson house during Robert's weekend visits. Victoria presented each witness with careful respect, allowing their testimonies to build a comprehensive picture of a father whose promises of reform consistently fell short of reality. But she noticed Judge Mitchell's growing impatience, his barely concealed eye rolls when Maria described her fears for Emma's safety. The lunch recess provided a brief respite from the courtroom's tension. Victoria and Maria sat in the courthouse cafeteria, reviewing the morning's developments over untouched sandwiches. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she described her daughter's recent nightmares, her fear of the dark that had emerged only after weekend visits with her father. Victoria reassured her client while privately calculating the uphill battle they faced. Judge Mitchell's bias was becoming increasingly apparent, his questions pointed and skeptical when directed toward Maria, deferential and accommodating when addressing Robert and his attorney.
The afternoon session brought expert testimony from court-appointed psychologists and social workers. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, who had evaluated both parents, testified that Maria provided a more stable environment for Emma's development. Her report documented Robert's inconsistent parenting style, his tendency to use Emma as a messenger in conflicts with Maria, his occasional failure to provide adequate meals during visitation periods. Judge Mitchell questioned Dr. Rodriguez's qualifications with unusual intensity, implying that her recommendations might be influenced by cultural biases rather than clinical judgment. Victoria objected to the line of questioning, but Mitchell overruled her with barely concealed irritation. Crawford seized on the judge's apparent skepticism, presenting his own expert witness, who painted a dramatically different picture of the Peterson family dynamics. Dr. Marcus Sullivan, whose credentials were impressive but whose testimony seemed rehearsed, suggested that Maria's work schedule and single-parent stress made her less suitable for primary custody. As the day wore on, Victoria began to recognize the futility of fighting both opposing counsel and a biased judge simultaneously. Her legal arguments were sound, her evidence compelling, but Judge Mitchell had apparently reached his decision before hearing all the facts. The final witness of the day was Emma herself, brought in for an in-camera interview that would determine her future. The 8-year-old entered the courtroom with obvious reluctance, her small hand clutching her mother's tightly before being led to the witness stand. Judge Mitchell's demeanor softened noticeably when addressing Emma, but Victoria detected the subtle leading nature of his questions. Rather than allowing the child to express her genuine preferences, he seemed to be guiding her toward answers that would support his predetermined conclusion. Victoria's cross-examination was gentle but thorough, allowing Emma to describe in her own words the differences between her two homes. The child's testimony painted a clear picture of feeling safer and more supported in her mother's care. But Judge Mitchell appeared unmoved by her obvious distress when discussing visits with her father. As court adjourned for the day, Victoria gathered her materials with growing frustration. The evidence clearly favored her client, but institutional bias seemed poised to override justice once again.
Judge Mitchell's smirk as he retired to chambers suggested he viewed the entire proceeding as little more than an administrative formality. Outside the courthouse, Maria Peterson fought back tears as she contemplated the possibility of losing primary custody of her daughter. Victoria promised to continue fighting, but privately wondered whether any argument could overcome the systemic prejudices that seemed to infect every aspect of their case. The second day of the Peterson custody hearing began with unexpected developments that would shift the entire trajectory of the case. Victoria arrived at the courthouse to find a cluster of reporters gathered near the main entrance, their cameras focused on a black sedan pulling into the judicial parking area. She recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Chief Justice Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking judicial officer in the state. Inside Superior Courtroom 7, an unusual tension filled the air. Court staff moved with heightened alertness, their usual casual demeanor replaced by professional urgency. Bailiffs straightened their uniforms, clerks double-checked their paperwork, and even the janitor seemed to polish surfaces with extra care. Judge Mitchell entered his courtroom with characteristic arrogance, but Victoria noticed something different in his bearing. His usual swagger seemed forced, his confident smile slightly strained. He settled behind the bench and called the Peterson case to order, apparently unaware that his judicial conduct was about to face unprecedented scrutiny. The morning's first witness was Dr. Catherine Mills, a child psychology expert whom Victoria had retained to provide independent assessment of Emma's emotional well-being. Dr. Mills had impressive credentials from Johns Hopkins and 20 years of experience in family court evaluations. Her testimony would prove crucial in demonstrating the psychological impact of the custody dispute on Emma. Crawford immediately challenged Dr. Mills' qualifications, suggesting that her relatively recent arrival in California made her unfamiliar with local standards and practices. Judge Mitchell seized on this objection with obvious enthusiasm, questioning whether out-of-state experts could adequately understand the nuances of California family law. Victoria's objection was swift and well-grounded. She cited numerous precedents establishing that expert witness qualifications were based on professional competence, not geographic residence. Her legal research was impeccable, her argument cogent and persuasive, yet Judge Mitchell dismissed her objection with barely concealed contempt. The exchange revealed the depth of Mitchell's bias in stark terms. His questions to Dr. Mills were hostile and leading, designed to undermine her credibility rather than elicit useful information. When the psychologist attempted to explain Emma's behavioral indicators of stress and anxiety, Mitchell interrupted repeatedly, suggesting that her interpretations were speculative rather than scientific. Dr. Mills remained professional despite the judicial hostility, methodically presenting her findings about Emma's emotional state. She described play therapy sessions where the 8-year-old had expressed fears about disappointing her father, anxiety about being caught between conflicting parental expectations, and confusion about adult relationships based on her parents' bitter conflicts.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The psychologist's most damning testimony concerned Robert Peterson's inconsistent parenting approach. During supervised visits arranged for her evaluation, she had observed him alternating between excessive permissiveness and sudden anger when Emma failed to meet his expectations. These behavioral patterns created an unstable environment that hindered the child's emotional development. Judge Mitchell's response to this testimony was telling. Rather than focusing on Emma's welfare, he seemed more concerned with defending Robert Peterson's reputation. His questions implied that Dr. Mills was biased against fathers, that her evaluation methodology favored maternal custody regardless of circumstances. Victoria watched this judicial misconduct with growing anger, but maintained her professional composure. She understood that direct confrontation with Judge Mitchell would only harm her client's case,
but the blatant unfairness of the proceedings demanded some form of response. During the lunch recess, Victoria made several phone calls from the courthouse steps. Her conversations were brief and cryptic, but observers might have noticed her mentioning judicial ethics and appellate review procedures. She also placed a call to the State Bar's Judicial Conduct Committee, documenting the morning's events in careful detail. The afternoon session brought testimony from Emma's school principal, Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, who had worked in education for 35 years. Her observations of Emma's behavior provided another window into the child's emotional state and the impact of the custody dispute on her academic performance. Mrs. Henderson described Emma as a bright, sensitive child who had shown marked changes in behavior over the past 6 months. The girl's grades had declined from A's and B's to C's and D's. Her participation in class activities had diminished, and she frequently appeared tired and distracted during school hours. More concerning were Emma's social interactions with classmates. She had become withdrawn and defensive, sometimes erupting in tears when other children mentioned their families. The school counselor had documented several incidents where Emma expressed guilt about loving both parents, feeling that any affection for one constituted betrayal of the other. Judge Mitchell's questioning of Mrs. Henderson revealed his determination to minimize evidence supporting Maria's custody claim. He suggested that Emma's academic decline might result from normal developmental challenges rather than custody-related stress. His implication that school personnel were unqualified to assess family dynamics showed stunning disregard for professional expertise. Victoria's cross-examination of Mrs. Henderson was masterful in its restraint and effectiveness. Rather than attacking Judge Mitchell's bias directly, she allowed the principal's testimony to speak for itself. Mrs. Henderson's detailed observations painted a clear picture of a child suffering under the weight of adult conflicts beyond her control. The day's final testimony came from an unexpected source, Robert Peterson himself. Crawford had apparently decided that his client's personal testimony would counter the mounting evidence against him. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Robert took the witness stand with obvious nervousness, his construction workers' confidence evaporating under courtroom scrutiny. Crawford's direct examination attempted to portray him as a devoted father whose rights were being unfairly challenged by a vindictive ex-wife and biased professionals. Victoria's cross-examination methodically dismantled Robert's carefully constructed image. She presented evidence of his drinking problem, not just the DUI conviction that was already part of the record, but testimony from neighbors about his erratic behavior during drinking episodes. Bank records showed a pattern of financial irresponsibility that had contributed to the marriage's collapse. Most damaging was Victoria's presentation of Robert's own statements recorded during court-ordered mediation sessions. His words revealed a man more concerned with winning against his ex-wife than with his daughter's welfare. He had explicitly stated that he would rather see Emma in foster care than allow Maria to maintain primary custody. Judge Mitchell's attempts to shield Robert from this devastating testimony were transparent and inappropriate. He sustained objections that had no legal basis, limited Victoria's cross-examination time without justification, and even suggested that mediation records should be considered privileged, despite clear precedent to the contrary. The courtroom drama reached its climax when Victoria presented audio recordings of Robert's threatening phone calls to Maria. His voice, slurred with alcohol and thick with rage, promised to destroy her professionally and personally if she didn't withdraw her custody petition. The threats were specific and frightening, describing in detail how he would use his construction industry connections to ensure Maria never worked in Sacramento again. Crawford objected strenuously to the recordings' admission, claiming they were obtained without proper authorization. Victoria calmly cited California's one-party consent law, explaining that Maria had every right to record conversations in which she participated. The legal foundation was solid and unassailable.
Judge Mitchell's response revealed the full extent of his corruption. Despite clear legal precedent supporting the recording's admissibility, he excluded them from evidence. His reasoning was tortured and legally indefensible, based on procedural technicalities that existed nowhere in actual law. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Mitchell's ruling became clear. Even Crawford seemed surprised by the judge's blatant favoritism, while Maria Peterson collapsed into quiet tears at the realization that justice had been perverted before her eyes. Victoria remained standing, her legal arguments still echoing in the suddenly quiet courtroom. The evidence supporting Maria's custody claim was overwhelming. The law was clearly on their side, yet institutional bias threatened to override both fact and justice. As court adjourned for the second day, Victoria gathered her materials with grim determination. The Peterson case had evolved beyond a simple custody dispute into something much more significant, a test of whether the legal system could overcome its own prejudices to protect those who needed protection most. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed Victoria for comments about the proceedings. She maintained professional discretion while privately calculating her next moves. The judicial misconduct she had witnessed demanded response, but her primary obligation remained to Emma Peterson and her mother. The evening would bring unexpected developments that would transform the entire case. But for now, Victoria focused on preparing for what she knew would be the most challenging day of her young legal career. The third morning of the Peterson custody hearing arrived with an electric tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Superior Courtroom 7. Word had spread through the courthouse grapevine about the previous day's controversial rulings, and several veteran attorneys had quietly slipped into the gallery to observe what many suspected would be an explosive conclusion to the case. Victoria entered the courtroom with a leather portfolio she hadn't carried during the first 2 days. Her demeanor remained professionally calm, but there was a new quality to her presence, a quiet intensity that suggested major developments were imminent. She exchanged brief greetings with Maria Peterson, who looked exhausted from sleepless nights worrying about her daughter's future. Judge Mitchell took the bench with his usual pompous ceremony, apparently oblivious to the growing scrutiny surrounding his conduct. The morning's first order of business was Crawford's motion to exclude additional evidence that Victoria had submitted overnight. The motion was transparently frivolous, designed more to delay proceedings than to address legitimate legal concerns. Victoria's response to Crawford's motion was swift and devastating. She cited a dozen recent appellate decisions that directly contradicted his arguments, her legal research so thorough that even Crawford seemed surprised by the depth of her preparation. Yet Judge Mitchell granted the motion anyway, offering reasoning so convoluted that several attorneys in the gallery exchanged incredulous glances.
The judicial misconduct had now crossed the line from bias into outright corruption. Mitchell was no longer simply favoring one party over another. He was actively subverting legal procedure to guarantee his preferred outcome. Victoria's objection was noted for the record, but her frustration was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The morning's testimony began with Dr. James Morrison, a forensic accountant whom Victoria had retained to analyze Robert Peterson's financial records. Dr. Morrison's findings painted a disturbing picture of financial irresponsibility that raised serious questions about Robert's ability to provide stable support for Emma. The accountant's testimony revealed that Robert had accumulated massive gambling debts over the past 2 years, borrowing against his construction business and even taking cash advances on credit cards to feed his addiction. Bank records showed late-night withdrawals from casino ATMs, online gambling transactions, and a pattern of financial behavior that suggested serious psychological problems. More damaging still was Dr. Morrison's discovery that Robert had been hiding assets from the divorce proceedings. He had opened secret accounts, transferred property to relatives, and even created a shell company to conceal income from his construction work.
This financial deception violated multiple court orders and constituted criminal fraud. Judge Mitchell's attempts to discredit Dr. Morrison's testimony were increasingly desperate and transparent. He questioned the accountant's methodology, suggested that financial problems were irrelevant to parenting ability, and even implied that gambling addiction was a personal choice rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. Victoria's cross-examination allowed Dr. Morrison to explain the direct connection between Robert's financial irresponsibility and Emma's welfare. The child's medical insurance had lapsed due to unpaid premiums. Her school expenses had gone unpaid, and even basic necessities like clothing and school supplies had been neglected while Robert pursued his gambling addiction. The testimony painted Robert Peterson not as a devoted father fighting for his rights, but as a man whose addictions and deceptions had already caused measurable harm to his daughter's well-being. The evidence was overwhelming and legally compelling, yet Judge Mitchell's expression suggested that facts would not influence his decision. During the morning recess, Victoria made another series of phone calls from the courthouse steps. This time, however, her conversations were overheard by several reporters who had gathered to cover what was becoming a significant story about judicial misconduct. Her mentions of emergency motions and appellate intervention suggested that she was preparing to escalate the matter beyond Judge Mitchell's courtroom. The afternoon session brought the case's most crucial testimony, Emma Peterson's second appearance before the court. The 8-year-old entered the courtroom with obvious reluctance, her small hand trembling as she was sworn in for what would prove to be the most important testimony of her young life. Judge Mitchell's questioning of Emma was subtly manipulative, designed to elicit responses that would support his predetermined conclusion. He asked leading questions about her father's love and devotion, while avoiding topics that might reveal Robert's problematic behavior. His tone was gentle, but his purpose was clear: to create a record that would justify awarding custody to the father despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Victoria's cross-examination of Emma was masterful in its sensitivity and effectiveness. Rather than traumatizing the child with aggressive interrogation, she created a safe space where Emma could express her genuine feelings and experiences. The result was heartbreaking testimony about a little girl caught between warring parents and desperate for stability. Emma's words painted a devastating picture of life with her father. She described his unpredictable mood swings, his frequent absences during scheduled visitation periods, and her fear of his angry outbursts when she mentioned missing her mother. Most damaging was her revelation that Robert had coached her to lie about their relationship, promising rewards if she told the judge what he wanted to hear. The child's testimony revealed the true cost of adult selfishness and institutional bias. Emma had internalized guilt about her parents' conflicts, believing that her love for both was somehow wrong or disloyal. She expressed fears about disappointing her father, while simultaneously describing her desperate need for the stability and safety she found in her mother's care. Judge Mitchell's response to Emma's testimony was telling. Rather than focusing on the child's welfare, he seemed primarily concerned with minimizing the impact of her revelations about Robert's behavior. His questions attempted to reframe her testimony, suggesting that her perceptions might be influenced by her mother's coaching rather than her own experiences. Victoria's objection to this line of questioning was immediate and forceful. She cited child protection statutes and appellate precedents that specifically prohibited judges from second-guessing children's testimony about parental behavior. Her legal argument was unassailable, but Judge Mitchell overruled her objection anyway. The afternoon's final witness was Maria Peterson herself, taking the stand to defend her fitness as a mother and her commitment to Emma's welfare. Her testimony was emotional but controlled, describing the sacrifices she had made to provide stability for her daughter despite the chaos created by her ex-husband's behavior. Her words painted a picture of a devoted mother working multiple shifts to support her child, attending every school event despite her demanding schedule, and providing the emotional security that Emma desperately needed. Crawford's cross-examination of Maria was aggressive and inappropriate, focusing more on attacking her character than challenging her fitness as a parent. He questioned her work schedule, her financial struggles, and even her decision to seek legal representation rather than accepting Robert's demands. His tactics were transparently designed to shame rather than illuminate. Judge Mitchell's complicity in Crawford's abusive questioning tactics revealed the full extent of his bias. He allowed irrelevant and prejudicial questions while preventing Victoria from protecting her client through appropriate objections. His conduct was so egregious that several observers began taking notes for what would inevitably become formal complaints. Victoria's redirect examination of Maria was brief but powerful, allowing her client to address Crawford's attacks while reinforcing her commitment to Emma's welfare. Maria's final words to the court were simple but profound. She wanted only what was best for her daughter, regardless of the personal cost to herself. As the testimony phase concluded, Victoria requested a brief recess to prepare her closing arguments. Judge Mitchell granted the request with obvious impatience, apparently eager to conclude proceedings and issue his predetermined ruling. The courtroom buzzed with tension as observers sensed that something significant was about to unfold. During the recess, Victoria made final preparations for what she knew would be the most important argument of her career. The evidence was overwhelmingly in her favor, but institutional bias threatened to override justice once again. She would need something extraordinary to break through Judge Mitchell's corruption and protect Emma Peterson from a custody arrangement that would endanger her welfare. Unknown to Judge Mitchell, that extraordinary moment was rapidly approaching, and it would transform not only the Peterson case, but his entire judicial career. The courtroom fell into expectant silence as Judge Mitchell prepared to deliver what everyone assumed would be his final remarks before issuing a custody decision. The gallery had been filled with an unusual number of observers, veteran attorneys, court staff members who had found excuses to linger, and even a few reporters who sensed that something significant was unfolding in Superior Courtroom 7. Victoria stood at the counsel table, her hands resting calmly on the leather portfolio that had become a source of curious speculation among courthouse observers. Her expression revealed nothing of the storm that was about to break, but those who knew her well might have detected the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed once against the table's surface before falling still. Judge Mitchell cleared his throat and began what he clearly expected to be his final pronouncement on the Peterson custody matter. His words dripped with condescension as he outlined his reasoning, dismissing the mountain of evidence supporting Maria's custody claim while magnifying every minor point in Robert's favor. His decision was a masterclass in judicial bias disguised as legal reasoning.
The judge's analysis twisted facts and ignored precedent with breathtaking audacity. He dismissed Dr. Mills's psychological evaluation as speculative, characterized Dr. Morrison's financial analysis as irrelevant to parenting capacity, and even suggested that Emma's own testimony about her fears was influenced by maternal coaching. His reasoning was so transparently corrupt that several attorneys in the gallery began whispering among themselves. Mitchell's voice grew increasingly confident as he approached his conclusion. He had orchestrated this outcome from the beginning, and nothing would prevent him from delivering the victory he had promised to Robert Peterson through subtle signals and biased rulings. His smirk widened as he prepared to announce his decision awarding primary custody to the father. But Victoria was not finished. She rose slowly from her chair, her movement causing Judge Mitchell to pause mid-sentence. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a new quality, not the deferential tone of a young attorney addressing a superior court, but something altogether different. Your Honor, before you conclude these proceedings, I believe there are several critical matters that require your immediate attention. Mitchell's irritation was palpable,
Counselor, you've had ample opportunity to present your case. I will not allow further delays or theatrical interruptions. Victoria's response was measured and precise. I understand your eagerness to conclude, Your Honor, but I'm afraid these matters cannot wait. They concern not only the Peterson case, but the integrity of these proceedings, and indeed this entire court. The judge's face flushed red. You are out of line, Counselor. Sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt. Instead of backing down, Victoria opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a document that caused several people in the courtroom to lean forward with curiosity. The official seal at the top was unmistakable. This was not ordinary legal paperwork. Your Honor, I hereby serve you with this emergency writ of mandamus, issued by the California Supreme Court, directing this court to cease all proceedings pending immediate judicial review. Her voice carried across the courtroom with crystal clarity. This writ was issued at the request of Chief Justice Patricia Williams, following a preliminary review of judicial conduct in this matter. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Judge Mitchell's face went from red to pale as the implications began to register. A writ of mandamus from the state's highest court was extraordinary and career-ending for judges who had provoked such intervention. But Victoria was far from finished with her revelations. Furthermore, Your Honor, I believe this court should be aware that these proceedings have been under direct observation by representatives of the Chief Justice's office since yesterday morning. She gestured toward the gallery, where a woman in a conservative gray suit rose from her seat in the back row. Miss Sandra Chen, Deputy Clerk of the California Supreme Court, has been documenting these proceedings for judicial review. Judge Mitchell's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced with a look of growing horror as he realized that his judicial career was collapsing in real time. But the worst was yet to come. Victoria's next words would shatter everything Harrison Mitchell thought he knew about power, authority, and his place in the judicial hierarchy. Your Honor, there is one final matter that requires immediate attention. She paused, allowing the tension to build. I must inform this court that I am not, as you have assumed, a public defender or legal aid attorney representing Mrs. Peterson pro bono. The courtroom was now completely silent, every person hanging on Victoria's words. My name is Victoria Chambers, and I'm currently serving as Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court on temporary assignment while Justice Williams recovers from surgery. I took this case personally because it represents exactly the kind of judicial bias and corruption that threatens the integrity of our entire system. The revelation hit Judge Mitchell like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, horror, and finally, a kind of nauseated recognition that his career was over. The young woman he had dismissed and patronized for 3 days was not only his superior in the judicial hierarchy, but the most powerful judge in the state of California. Victoria continued with devastating precision. For the past 3 days, I have witnessed judicial conduct that violates every principle of legal ethics and constitutional due process. This court has demonstrated bias so extreme and systematic that it constitutes a complete perversion of justice. She began documenting Mitchell's misconduct with the methodical precision of a Supreme Court justice building a case for judicial removal. Each biased ruling, each inappropriate interruption, each violation of legal procedure was laid out with the kind of detail that would prove devastating in disciplinary proceedings. This court excluded legally admissible evidence without justification, prevented cross-examination of witnesses, and demonstrated such obvious bias that the proceedings constitute a denial of due process under the 14th Amendment. Victoria's voice remained calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of her true position. Judge Mitchell tried desperately to salvage his situation. Your Honor, there must be some misunderstanding. I was simply attempting to ensure fair proceedings for both parties. Victoria's response was swift and merciless. Your Honor, I have 3 days of documented evidence that proves otherwise. Your conduct in this courtroom has been so egregious that it demands immediate intervention by the California Commission on Judicial Performance. She turned to address the packed courtroom, her voice carrying the full authority of her office. The Peterson custody matter will be transferred immediately to Judge Rebecca Martinez for fair and impartial consideration. Judge Martinez is known for her integrity and commitment to child welfare, and I'm confident she will render a decision based on law and evidence rather than bias and prejudice. The implications for Robert Peterson were immediately apparent. Without Judge Mitchell's protection, his custody claim would be evaluated fairly, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Crawford gathered his papers hastily, recognizing that his client's case had just collapsed completely. Maria Peterson sat in stunned silence, barely able to process that her daughter's future had just been saved by this extraordinary turn of events. Emma would remain in her care, protected from a father whose addictions and instability had been thoroughly documented despite Mitchell's attempts to ignore the evidence. Victoria's final words to Judge Mitchell were delivered with the cold precision of judicial authority. Your Honor, you will receive formal notice of disciplinary proceedings within 48 hours. I strongly recommend that you retain competent legal counsel, as the charges against you will include judicial misconduct, denial of due process, and possible corruption. The courtroom began to empty as the full scope of the day's revelations sank in. Reporters rushed to file stories about the unprecedented judicial intervention, while attorneys whispered about the implications for other cases that had appeared before Judge Mitchell's biased court. Crawford approached Victoria with obvious nervousness, attempting to negotiate some kind of settlement for his client. She listened politely before explaining that Robert Peterson's custody case would now be decided solely on evidence and law, luxuries he had not enjoyed under Judge Mitchell's corrupt protection. As the courtroom finally cleared, Maria Peterson approached Victoria with tears of gratitude. The Chief Justice's response was characteristically humble. She had simply done what any judge should do, ensuring that the law was applied fairly regardless of personal prejudice or institutional bias.
The Peterson case would conclude within a week under Judge Martinez's fair administration. Robert Peterson, faced with overwhelming evidence of his unfitness as a parent, would voluntarily surrender his custody claims in exchange for supervised visitation rights. Emma would remain with her mother, protected from the chaos and instability that had threatened to destroy her young life. But the broader implications of Judge Mitchell's exposure would reverberate throughout California's judicial system for months to come. Victoria's dramatic revelation had not only saved one child from an inappropriate custody arrangement, but it sent a clear message that judicial bias and corruption would not be tolerated at any level of the court system. The story of the young lawyer who turned out to be the Chief Justice would become legendary in legal circles, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that even the most powerful figures in the legal system are accountable for their actions. The news of Judge Harrison Mitchell's exposure spread through California's legal community like wildfire. Within hours of Victoria's revelation, law firms across the state began reviewing cases that had appeared before his court, searching for patterns of bias that might justify appeals or misconduct complaints. The ripple effects of his corruption would ultimately impact hundreds of families whose cases had been tainted by his prejudiced rulings. 3 weeks after the dramatic conclusion of the Peterson hearing, Victoria sat in her actual office at the California Supreme Court reviewing the preliminary report from the Commission on Judicial Performance. The investigation into Judge Mitchell's conduct had uncovered a disturbing pattern of bias spanning his entire 30-year career, with particular discrimination against women, minorities, and anyone he perceived as lacking social standing. The Commission's report detailed dozens of cases where Mitchell had demonstrated clear prejudice. Family court records revealed a systematic pattern of awarding custody to fathers, regardless of evidence, particularly when mothers were represented by public defenders or legal aid attorneys. His criminal court docket showed disproportionate sentencing for defendants of color, while white defendants with similar charges received inexplicably lenient treatment. Most disturbing were the financial irregularities that investigators had uncovered. Mitchell owned properties far beyond what his judicial salary could support, including a vacation home in Napa Valley and a yacht docked in San Francisco Bay. Bank records suggested cash deposits that coincided suspiciously with controversial rulings in high-profile cases. The investigation had also revealed Mitchell's membership in an exclusive country club where he regularly played golf with prominent defense attorneys and business leaders. Several witnesses testified that he had been overheard making racist and sexist comments during these social gatherings,
expressing particular disdain for young attorneys who didn't share his privileged background. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Judge Rebecca Martinez, who had taken over the Peterson case and several other matters transferred from Mitchell's docket. The message was brief but encouraging. Robert Peterson had completed his court-ordered rehabilitation program and was making genuine progress in addressing his gambling addiction. More importantly, Emma Peterson was thriving in her mother's care, her grades improving, and her emotional stability returning. The successful resolution of the Peterson case had become a symbol of what the judicial system could accomplish when freed from bias and corruption. Emma's latest school report showed straight A's, and her teacher noted a remarkable transformation in her classroom behavior. The anxiety and depression that had characterized her during the custody dispute had largely disappeared once she felt secure in her mother's care. Maria Peterson had also found new stability in her life. The nursing supervisor position she had been offered at St. Mary's Hospital came with better hours and significantly higher pay, allowing her to spend more quality time with Emma while building financial security for their future. She had even begun taking evening classes towards a master's degree in nursing administration. Victoria's involvement in the Peterson case had sparked broader reforms throughout California's family court system. The Chief Justice had mandated new training programs for judges handling custody matters, emphasizing the importance of evidence-based decisions and the psychological impact of bias on children. Court observers had been assigned to monitor proceedings in several jurisdictions where patterns of discrimination had been identified. The most significant change was the implementation of anonymous case review systems, where appellant panels would examine family court decisions without knowing which judges had issued them. This innovation was designed to identify systematic bias patterns that might otherwise go undetected until dramatic interventions like Victoria's became necessary. Crawford, Robert Peterson's attorney, had also faced consequences for his role in perpetuating Mitchell's corrupt system. The State Bar's investigation revealed that he had knowingly exploited the judge's biases, tailoring his arguments to appeal to Mitchell's prejudices rather than legal merit. He faced disciplinary action, including suspension from practice and mandatory ethics training. The legal community's response to Victoria's revelation had been overwhelmingly positive, with many attorneys expressing gratitude that someone with her authority had taken direct action against judicial corruption. Several law schools had invited her to speak about the case, using it as a teaching example of how systemic bias could be confronted and overcome. But not everyone appreciated Victoria's methods. Some conservative judicial organizations criticized her deception, arguing that she had violated ethical boundaries by concealing her identity during the proceedings. They suggested that her actions, however well-intentioned, had undermined the dignity and authority of the court system. Victoria addressed these criticisms during a press conference at the California Supreme Court building. Her response was measured but firm, explaining that extraordinary circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures. The systematic denial of due process in Mitchell's courtroom had threatened the constitutional rights of countless litigants, justifying intervention by whatever means necessary. She emphasized that her deception had been temporary and limited in scope, designed specifically to document judicial misconduct that might otherwise have remained hidden. The evidence she had gathered would not have been obtainable through traditional oversight mechanisms, which had clearly failed to detect Mitchell's corruption despite decades of biased rulings. The press conference also addressed the broader implications of the Mitchell case for judicial reform. Victoria announced the creation of a special commission to review judicial conduct procedures statewide, ensuring that bias and corruption could be identified and addressed before reaching crisis levels. The commission would include representatives from minority bar associations, women's legal organizations, and civil rights groups. Public reaction to Victoria's revelation had been overwhelmingly supportive, with many people expressing admiration for her willingness to personally confront injustice rather than relying on bureaucratic procedures that had proven inadequate. Emma Peterson herself had become something of a symbol for children caught in biased custody systems. Her case illustrated how judicial prejudice could endanger the most vulnerable members of society, turning legal proceedings into instruments of oppression rather than protection. Victoria received hundreds of letters from parents who had faced similar bias in family courts across the country. The Peterson case had also attracted national attention from legal reform advocates who saw it as a template for addressing systemic bias in state court systems. Several other states had begun implementing similar oversight procedures, including anonymous case reviews and mandatory bias training for family court judges. Victoria's calendar now included regular meetings with judicial reform organizations, bar associations, and civil rights groups working to address discrimination in court systems. Her experience in the Peterson case had transformed her from an administrator of justice into an active advocate for judicial reform. The financial investigation into Judge Mitchell had revealed connections to a broader network of corruption involving court personnel, attorneys, and even some law enforcement officials. Federal prosecutors had opened a criminal investigation into what appeared to be an organized system of case-fixing and influence peddling that extended far beyond one biased judge. Several other judges in Mitchell's judicial district had requested transfers or early retirement rather than face similar scrutiny. The California Commission on Judicial Performance had received dozens of new complaints as attorneys and litigants found courage to report misconduct they had previously accepted as inevitable.
Victoria's law clerks had compiled a comprehensive database of cases that would likely be affected by Mitchell's removal from the bench. The appellate courts were preparing for an influx of appeals from litigants who could now demonstrate that their cases had been decided by a corrupt judge rather than by legal merit. The Peterson case had also sparked academic interest from law schools and judicial training institutions. Victoria had commissioned a study of the case to be used in judicial education programs, illustrating how unconscious bias could evolve into systematic corruption without proper oversight and accountability. Most importantly, the case had demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems of bias and privilege could be challenged successfully when confronted with courage, preparation, and unwavering commitment to justice. Victoria's willingness to risk her professional reputation to protect one child had ultimately protected countless others who might have suffered under Mitchell's continued rule. As Victoria reviewed the final report on the Peterson case, she reflected on the lessons learned from her unprecedented intervention. The legal system's greatest strength lay not in its traditions or hierarchies, but in its capacity for self-correction when individuals with courage and authority were willing to act decisively against injustice. The transformation of Superior Courtroom 7 from a place of bias and corruption into a symbol of judicial reform would stand as testimony to the power of individual action in service of systemic change. Emma Peterson's future had been secured, but more importantly, the futures of countless other children would be protected by the reforms triggered by one Chief Justice's refusal to accept that injustice was inevitable. The news of Judge Harrison Mitchell's exposure spread through California's legal community like wildfire. Within hours of Victoria's revelation, law firms across the state began reviewing cases that had appeared before his court, searching for patterns of bias that might justify appeals or misconduct complaints. The ripple effects of his corruption would ultimately impact hundreds of families whose cases had been tainted by his prejudiced rulings. 3 weeks after the dramatic conclusion of the Peterson hearing, Victoria sat in her actual office at the California Supreme Court, reviewing the preliminary report from the Commission on Judicial Performance. The investigation into Judge Mitchell's conduct had uncovered a disturbing pattern of bias spanning his entire 30-year career, with particular discrimination against women, minorities, and anyone he perceived as lacking social standing. The Commission's report detailed dozens of cases where Mitchell had demonstrated clear prejudice. Family court records revealed a systematic pattern of awarding custody to fathers, regardless of evidence, particularly when mothers were represented by public defenders or legal aid attorneys. His criminal court docket showed disproportionate sentencing for defendants of color, while white defendants with similar charges received inexplicably lenient treatment. Most disturbing were the financial irregularities that investigators had uncovered. Mitchell owned properties far beyond what his judicial salary could support, including a vacation home in Napa Valley and a yacht docked in San Francisco Bay. Bank records suggested cash deposits that coincided suspiciously with controversial rulings in high-profile cases. The investigation had also revealed Mitchell's membership in an exclusive country club where he regularly played golf with prominent defense attorneys and business leaders. Several witnesses testified that he had been overheard making racist and sexist comments during these social gatherings, expressing particular disdain for young attorneys who didn't share his privileged background. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Judge Rebecca Martinez, who had taken over the Peterson case and several other matters transferred from Mitchell's docket. The message was brief but encouraging. Robert Peterson had completed his court-ordered rehabilitation program and was making genuine progress in addressing his gambling addiction. More importantly, Emma Peterson was thriving in her mother's care, her grades improving and her emotional stability returning. The successful resolution of the Peterson case had become a symbol of what the judicial system could accomplish when freed from bias and corruption. Emma's latest school report showed straight A's, and her teacher noted a remarkable transformation in her classroom behavior. The anxiety and depression that had characterized her during the custody dispute had largely disappeared once she felt secure in her mother's care. Maria Peterson had also found new stability in her life. The nursing supervisor position she'd been offered at St. Mary's Hospital came with better hours and significantly higher pay, allowing her to spend more quality time with Emma while building financial security for their future. She'd even begun taking evening classes toward a master's degree in nursing administration. Victoria's involvement in the Peterson case had sparked broader reforms throughout California's family court system. The Chief Justice had mandated new training programs for judges handling custody matters, emphasizing the importance of evidence-based decisions and the psychological impact of bias on children. Court observers had been assigned to monitor proceedings in several jurisdictions where patterns of discrimination had been identified. The most significant change was the implementation of anonymous case review systems, where appellate panels would examine family court decisions without knowing which judges had issued them. This innovation was designed to identify systematic bias patterns that might otherwise go undetected until dramatic interventions like Victoria's became necessary. Crawford, Robert Peterson's attorney, had also faced consequences for his role in perpetuating Mitchell's corrupt system. The state bar's investigation revealed that he had knowingly exploited the judge's biases, tailoring his arguments to appeal to Mitchell's prejudices rather than legal merit. He faced disciplinary action, including suspension from practice and mandatory ethics training. The legal community's response to Victoria's revelation had been overwhelmingly positive, with many attorneys expressing gratitude that someone with her authority had taken direct action against judicial corruption. Several law schools had invited her to speak about the case, using it as a teaching example of how systemic bias could be confronted and overcome. However, not everyone appreciated Victoria's methods. Some conservative judicial organizations criticized her deception, arguing that she had violated ethical boundaries by concealing her identity during the proceedings. They suggested that her actions, however well-intentioned, had undermined the dignity and authority of the court system. Victoria addressed these criticisms during a press conference at the California Supreme Court building. Her response was measured but firm, explaining that extraordinary circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures. The systematic denial of due process in Mitchell's courtroom had threatened the constitutional rights of countless litigants, justifying intervention by whatever means necessary. She emphasized that her deception had been temporary and limited in scope,
designed specifically to document judicial misconduct that might otherwise have remained hidden. The evidence she had gathered would not have been obtainable through traditional oversight mechanisms, which had clearly failed to detect Mitchell's corruption despite decades of biased rulings. The press conference also addressed the broader implications of the Mitchell case for judicial reform. Victoria announced the creation of a special commission to review judicial conduct procedures statewide, ensuring that bias and corruption could be identified and addressed before reaching crisis levels. The commission would include representatives from minority bar associations, women's legal organizations, and civil rights groups. Public reaction to Victoria's revelation had been overwhelmingly supportive, with many people expressing admiration for her willingness to personally confront injustice rather than relying on bureaucratic procedures that had proven inadequate. Social media buzzed with praise for the Chief Justice who had gone undercover to protect a vulnerable child and her mother. Emma Peterson herself had become something of a symbol for children caught in biased custody systems. Her case illustrated how judicial prejudice could endanger the most vulnerable members of society, turning legal proceedings into instruments of oppression rather than protection. Victoria received hundreds of letters from parents who had faced similar bias in family courts across the country. The Peterson case had also attracted national attention from legal reform advocates who saw it as a template for addressing systemic bias in state court systems. Several other states had begun implementing similar oversight procedures, including anonymous case reviews and mandatory bias training for family court judges. Victoria's calendar now included regular meetings with judicial reform organizations, bar associations, and civil rights groups working to address discrimination in court systems. Her experience in the Peterson case had transformed her from an administrator of justice into an active advocate for judicial reform.
The financial investigation into Judge Mitchell had revealed connections to a broader network of corruption, involving court personnel, attorneys, and even some law enforcement officials. Federal prosecutors had opened a criminal investigation into what appeared to be an organized system of case-fixing and influence peddling that extended far beyond one biased judge. Several other judges in Mitchell's judicial district had requested transfers or early retirement rather than face similar scrutiny. The California Commission on Judicial Performance had received dozens of new complaints as attorneys and litigants found courage to report misconduct they had previously accepted as inevitable. Victoria's law clerks had compiled a comprehensive database of cases that would likely be affected by Mitchell's removal from the bench. The appellate courts were preparing for an influx of appeals from litigants who could now demonstrate that their cases had been decided by a corrupt judge rather than by legal merit. The Peterson case had also sparked academic interest from law schools and judicial training institutions. Victoria had commissioned a study of the case to be used in judicial education programs, illustrating how unconscious bias could evolve into systematic corruption without proper oversight and accountability. Most importantly, the case had demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems of bias and privilege could be challenged successfully when confronted with courage, preparation, and unwavering commitment to justice. Victoria's willingness to risk her professional reputation to protect one child had ultimately protected countless others who might have suffered under Mitchell's continued rule. As Victoria reviewed the final report on the Peterson case, she reflected on the lessons learned from her unprecedented intervention. The legal system's greatest strength lay not in its traditions or hierarchies, but in its capacity for self-correction when individuals with courage and authority were willing to act decisively against injustice. The transformation of Superior Courtroom 7 from a place of bias and corruption into a symbol of judicial reform would stand as testimony to the power of individual action in service of systemic change. Emma Peterson's future had been secured, but more importantly, the futures of countless other children would be protected by the reforms triggered by one Chief Justice's refusal to accept that injustice was inevitable. 6 months after the Peterson case concluded, Victoria found herself addressing the annual conference of the National Association of Women Judges in Chicago. The ballroom at the Palmer House Hotel was packed with over 800 female jurists from across the United States, all eager to hear from the Chief Justice, whose undercover investigation had become legendary in legal circles. Her keynote speech focused on the subtle ways that bias infiltrates judicial decision-making, often without conscious awareness. She shared research data showing how implicit prejudices could influence everything from bail decisions to sentencing patterns, creating systemic inequities that undermined public confidence in the legal system. The audience was particularly interested in her methodology during the Peterson case. Victoria explained how she had prepared for her undercover role by studying the typical challenges faced by legal aid attorneys, reviewing case law on family court procedures, and even practicing a more deferential courtroom demeanor that would mask her true authority and experience. During the question-and-answer session, a federal judge from Texas asked about the ethical implications of her deception. Victoria acknowledged the complexity of the issue while defending her actions as necessary to protect vulnerable litigants from documented judicial corruption that had persisted for decades without intervention. The conference also featured a panel discussion about implementing oversight mechanisms to prevent future cases like Mitchell's. Participants shared strategies from their own jurisdictions, including peer review systems, mandatory continuing education on bias recognition, and technology solutions that could flag unusual patterns in judicial decision-making. Back in Sacramento, the ripple effects of Victoria's intervention continued to transform the legal landscape. The California State Bar had established a new task force on judicial accountability chaired by retired Supreme Court Justice Margaret Thompson. The task force was developing recommendations for legislative reforms that would strengthen oversight of judicial conduct while protecting judicial independence. One of the most significant developments was the creation of a whistleblower protection program for court personnel who witnessed judicial misconduct. Previously, clerks and bailiffs who observed problematic behavior had little recourse without risking their careers. The new program provided confidential reporting mechanisms and legal protection for those who came forward with evidence of bias or corruption. The technological innovations sparked by the Peterson case were also bearing fruit. A pilot program using artificial intelligence to analyze judicial decisions had identified several judges whose rulings showed statistical patterns suggesting possible bias. These judges were being quietly counseled and monitored, with additional training provided where necessary. Emma Peterson, now 9 years old, had become an inadvertent symbol of children's rights in family court proceedings. Her mother, Maria, had been invited to speak at several conferences about the impact of judicial bias on families, sharing their story as a cautionary tale about what could happen when personal prejudice overcame professional responsibility. Emma herself remained largely shielded from the public attention, but her academic and emotional recovery continued to exceed all expectations. Her fourth-grade teacher reported that she was not only excelling academically, but had also become a leader among her classmates, often standing up for other children who were being treated unfairly. Robert Peterson's journey toward rehabilitation had proven more complex than initially hoped. While he had successfully completed his court-mandated gambling addiction program, underlying issues with alcohol abuse and anger management required ongoing treatment. His supervised visits with Emma were proceeding cautiously, with gradual increases in contact time as he demonstrated consistent progress. The criminal investigation into Mitchell's financial irregularities had uncovered a sophisticated network of corruption involving several prominent attorneys and at least 2 other judges. Federal prosecutors were building racketeering cases that could result in decades of prison time for participants in what appeared to be a systematic scheme to sell judicial decisions to the highest bidder. Crawford, who had been Mitchell's former ally, had negotiated a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced disciplinary sentence. His testimony was proving crucial in mapping the full extent of the corruption network,
revealing how case assignments were manipulated to ensure that certain attorneys received favorable treatment from complicit judges. Victoria's office had received thousands of letters from attorneys and litigants across the country, sharing stories of suspected judicial bias in their own jurisdictions. Her staff had created a database of these reports, looking for patterns that might indicate systemic problems requiring intervention at the federal level. The most disturbing letters came from family court litigants who described experiences similar to Maria Peterson's: evidence being ignored, expert testimony dismissed, and children's welfare sacrificed to judicial prejudice. Victoria had forwarded the most serious complaints to appropriate oversight bodies, triggering investigations in multiple states. Law schools had begun incorporating the Peterson case into their curricula as a teaching tool for courses on judicial ethics, civil procedure, and constitutional law. Students analyzed Victoria's strategies and debated the ethical implications of her methods, preparing a new generation of attorneys to recognize and confront bias in the legal system. The case had also sparked international interest from judicial reform organizations in other countries. Victoria had received invitations to speak at conferences in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, where similar problems with judicial bias had been documented, but solutions remained elusive. One unexpected consequence of the Peterson case was its impact on law school admissions and career choices. Applications to law schools had surged among women of color, many citing Victoria's example as inspiration for pursuing legal careers focused on social justice and systemic reform. The California Judicial Council had commissioned a comprehensive study of family court outcomes, comparing decisions made before and after the reforms triggered by the Peterson case. Preliminary data suggested significant improvements in the consistency and fairness of custody decisions, with particularly notable progress in cases involving minority families.
Victoria's personal life had been inevitably affected by her newfound fame. Speaking engagements and reform initiatives consumed much of her time outside regular Supreme Court duties, leaving little opportunity for the quiet contemplation that had always been her preferred approach to complex legal problems. Despite the demands on her time, Victoria made it a priority to maintain contact with the Peterson family. She attended Emma's school performances and birthday parties when possible, serving as an unofficial mentor to a child who had unknowingly become the catalyst for widespread judicial reform. The media attention surrounding the case had been largely positive, but Victoria remained wary of celebrity culture's tendency to oversimplify complex issues. She consistently redirected interviews away from her personal story toward the broader systemic problems that the Peterson case had revealed. Legal scholars had begun studying the Peterson case as an example of how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. Several academic papers analyzed Victoria's strategic approach, examining how her careful documentation and dramatic revelation had maximized the impact of her intervention. The case had also influenced legislative discussions at both state and federal levels. Congressional hearings on judicial accountability had featured testimony about the Peterson case, with lawmakers exploring whether federal oversight mechanisms were needed to address systemic bias in state court systems. As Victoria reflected on the 6 months since her dramatic revelation in Superior Courtroom 7, she remained focused on the work still to be done. The Peterson case had been a victory for one family and a catalyst for broader reforms, but countless other families continued to face bias and corruption in courtrooms across the country. The transformation of California's judicial system was accelerating, with new oversight mechanisms, training programs, and accountability measures being implemented at an unprecedented pace. However, Victoria understood that lasting change would require sustained effort and vigilance from the entire legal community. The legacy of the Peterson case would ultimately be measured not by the dramatic courtroom revelation that had captured public attention, but by the thousands of future cases that would be decided fairly because one Chief Justice had refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. Emma Peterson's future had been secured,
But more importantly, the futures of countless other children would be protected by the courage of those willing to confront bias wherever it appeared. 1 year after the Peterson case transformed California's judicial landscape, Victoria stood before the United States Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., preparing for the most significant oral argument of her career. The case before the nation's highest court would determine whether her reforms in California could serve as a model for federal legislation mandating judicial oversight nationwide. The morning was crisp and clear, with autumn leaves scattered across the courthouse steps where dozens of reporters had gathered to cover what legal scholars were calling the most important judicial reform case in decades. Inside the marble halls, representatives from civil rights organizations, bar associations, and judicial reform groups had filled every available seat. The case, formally titled Coalition for Judicial Accountability versus Administrative Office of the United States Courts, challenged the adequacy of current federal oversight mechanisms for addressing systematic bias in state court systems. Victoria's dramatic intervention in the Peterson case had become the centerpiece of arguments supporting expanded federal authority to monitor and correct judicial misconduct. As she entered the Supreme Court chamber, Victoria reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a Sacramento courtroom to the nation's highest tribunal. The young woman who had once sat quietly while Judge Mitchell displayed his prejudice was now arguing before 9 justices whose decision could reshape American jurisprudence. Chief Justice Samuel Rodriguez called the session to order, and Victoria approached the lectern with the same quiet confidence she had shown throughout the Peterson case. Her opening statement was precise and powerful, outlining how systematic judicial bias violated the constitutional guarantee of equal protection under law. She described the extensive research conducted since the Peterson case, documenting similar patterns of discrimination in family courts across multiple states. Statistical analyses revealed disturbing disparities in custody decisions, with minority mothers losing parental rights at rates significantly higher than their white counterparts, even when controlling for income, education, and other relevant factors. Justice Elena Morales interrupted with a pointed question about the boundaries of federal authority in state court systems. Victoria's response demonstrated the careful legal reasoning that had made her California's youngest Chief Justice, explaining how constitutional due process requirements created federal jurisdiction over cases involving systematic bias. The opposing counsel, representing traditional judicial independence advocates, argued that Victoria's methods had been inappropriate and that existing oversight mechanisms were adequate to address isolated cases of misconduct. Their position reflected the tension between judicial autonomy and accountability that had persisted throughout American legal history. Victoria's rebuttal was devastating in its simplicity. She presented evidence showing that isolated cases of bias were actually part of systematic patterns that had persisted for decades without correction through traditional oversight. The Peterson case had succeeded because conventional mechanisms had failed so completely. Justice David Chen raised concerns about the practical implementation of expanded oversight, questioning whether federal monitoring could be accomplished without undermining the independence that was essential to fair judicial decision-making. Victoria acknowledged the challenge while presenting detailed proposals for accountability measures that would preserve judicial discretion in appropriate cases. The oral argument lasted nearly 2 hours, with each justice probing different aspects of the proposed reforms. Victoria's responses revealed the depth of preparation and legal scholarship that had gone into developing the post-Peterson oversight system, addressing concerns about cost, implementation, and potential unintended consequences. Following the Supreme Court argument, Victoria returned to Sacramento to find that the Peterson case continued generating new developments. Emma Peterson, now 10 years old, had written a letter to the California legislature supporting a bill that would provide legal representation for all children in contested custody cases. Her articulate advocacy impressed lawmakers and demonstrated the long-term impact of ensuring that children's voices were heard in legal proceedings. Maria Peterson had completed her master's degree and been promoted to Director of Nursing Education at St. Mary's Hospital. Her professional success represented not just personal achievement, but validation of the family court system's capacity to protect capable parents from prejudiced judicial decisions. She frequently spoke at conferences about her experience, advocating for reforms that would prevent other families from enduring similar ordeals. Robert Peterson's rehabilitation had progressed to the point where supervised visits were no longer necessary, though his relationship with Emma remained complicated by the trauma of the custody battle. He had established a small business installing solar panels, channeling his construction skills into work that contributed positively to environmental sustainability. The criminal prosecution stemming from the Mitchell investigation had concluded with convictions for racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy. Mitchell himself received a 12-year federal prison sentence, while Crawford and 2 other attorneys received shorter terms in exchange for their cooperation. The sentences sent a clear message that judicial corruption would face serious consequences.
The technological innovations pioneered in California had been adopted by courts in 15 other states, with artificial intelligence systems now monitoring judicial decisions for statistical patterns suggesting bias. Early results were promising, with several judges voluntarily seeking additional training after being alerted to concerning trends in their decision-making. Law schools across the country had integrated the Peterson case into mandatory courses on professional responsibility and judicial ethics. A new generation of attorneys was being trained to recognize and challenge bias, creating a professional culture that would be less tolerant of the discrimination that had once been accepted as inevitable. The international impact of Victoria's intervention continued to expand, with judicial reform organizations in dozens of countries studying her methods and implementing similar oversight mechanisms. The Peterson case had become a global symbol of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. Victoria's personal transformation had been as significant as the institutional changes she had inspired. The reserved legal scholar who had once focused primarily on appellate procedure had become a national advocate for judicial reform, speaking regularly about the need for courts to reflect the diversity and values of the communities they served. Her relationship with Emma Peterson had evolved into something resembling mentorship, with the Chief Justice providing guidance as the young girl navigated the complexities of growing up in the public eye. Emma's resilience and intelligence suggested a bright future, possibly including a legal career inspired by her inadvertent role in reforming the justice system. The Supreme Court's decision in Coalition for Judicial Accountability would come 3 months later, upholding Victoria's reforms by a 7-2 margin and establishing federal authority to address systematic bias in state court systems. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Rodriguez, cited the Peterson case extensively as evidence of the need for enhanced oversight mechanisms. As Victoria reviewed the Supreme Court's opinion from her Sacramento office, she was struck by how far the legal system had progressed since that morning when she first entered Superior Courtroom 7. The arrogant smirk that had once characterized judicial bias had been replaced by genuine accountability and respect for all litigants regardless of their background or representation. The Peterson case had ultimately demonstrated that justice was not an abstract concept, but a daily choice made by individuals within institutions. Victoria's decision to confront bias directly, despite personal and professional risks, had protected not only Emma Peterson, but countless other children whose cases would now be decided fairly. The young lawyer who had once sat quietly while a biased judge prepared to destroy a family had become the Chief Justice who transformed how America thinks about judicial accountability. Her legacy would be measured not in dramatic courtroom revelations, but in the millions of future cases that would be decided without the corruption and prejudice that had once seemed inevitable.
Emma Peterson would grow up in a legal system fundamentally changed by her childhood trauma, transformed into something more just and equitable by adults who refused to accept that bias was simply the price of judicial independence. The smirk that had once symbolized unchecked judicial arrogance had been replaced by the accountability that democracy demanded and that justice required.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.